Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this UK-India Business Council webinar on e-learning in India, featuring speakers from two e-learning companies, Promethean and Quipper, who will share their insights. My name is Adriana Vega. I'm Policy and Research Manager here at the UK-India Business Council, and I will be moderating the session. With an average age of 25 and a potential shortage of 250 million skilled workers by 2022, India faces a huge education challenge. E-learning and digital technologies have a role to play, but implementation is not always straightforward. In today's session, we will discuss how digital technologies can help upskill millions of young Indians and explore some of the models that work. This webinar is the first in our e-learning in India series, and it follows the launch of our e-learning white paper. The next webinar on e-learning will take place on the 21st of May, and it will be covering solutions for a two-speed India, rural versus urban. Registrations are now open, and you can go to our website to get more information. You may also wish to look for the e-learning India hashtag on Twitter to join the Twitter discussions and debate. We will also be tweeting live through the course of the webinar, so feel free to join in the discussions. Before we begin, I would like to familiarize you with the toolbox on the right-hand side of your screen. Just to let you know, we will have everyone on mute during the course of the webinar to keep any background noise to a minimum. But if you do have a question, please drop it in the little bracket on the toolbox to your right in the Please Type Your Question Here box to send me your question, and I will take it up during our Q&A session at the end. For now, just to make sure that you can all hear me clearly, could I please ask that you all use the Raise Your Hand button on the toolbar? It's on the right-hand side. Again, can you please click the Raise Your Hand button? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now I would like to welcome John Collick, who is the first of our speakers today. He is Senior Education Consultant at Promethean, for his insights on India's huge education challenge and the role that e-learning has to play. John?
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is John Collick. I work with Promethean. What I want to do over the next 15 minutes or thereabouts is talk about some of the strategic implications of implementing ICT in education to help try and answer the question, will digital technologies help India overcome challenges in education? The answer is a qualified guess, but the implementation of ICT has to be approached from a strategic point of view, bearing it with a couple of key areas that need to be focused on. Could you pop next slide, please? Thank you. I mean, I've been working in education, with technology in education now for 15 years as an educator, but also as a working in the technology itself. And for me, this image sums up perfectly the relationship between education and technology. And I'm sure you can guess which is technology and which is education. The issue with technology is that it changes extremely rapidly, and every month new, cool, exciting ICT is produced. And what unfortunately has tended to happen is that education has tended to follow the technology rather than the other way around. And this can often lead to expensive failures, to be absolutely honest, where technology, which appears to be have great potential, is implemented without any real strategic consideration to the education goals. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So, I mean, if there was one thing that I would like people to take away from my part of this discussion is what I see as the golden rule, which is that effective implementation of ICT in class in education is driven by education goals, not technology goals. This, I think, is fundamental to the effective use of technology throughout education. We have to think about what are we trying to achieve from an education point of view, from national level all the way down to the actual class level, before we even start to think about which technology we're going to implement and how we're going to implement it. So what do we mean by education goals? Sorry, next slide. Thank you. what do we mean by educational goals? Well, I'll start by talking about education goals from a national level, because I work strategically with governments throughout the world to look at how to implement effective technology policy. Next slide. Thank you. So the text on my slides seems to have it's shrunk, so it's perhaps a little bit difficult to read. But the first category, which everybody thinks about, is economic growth. But the purpose of education is to educate a skill, a workforce, in order to improve GDP. And obviously, the more educated people are, the better jobs they tend to get, the more they tend to earn, the more taxes they pay, and so this becomes good for the economy. But this isn't the only education goal that we need to think about. Next slide. Thanks. Social cohesion is also a fundamental education goal for nations throughout the world. And there's been very interesting research being done in, for example, the impact of very early years education on social cohesion. Things like compassion, involvement in the community, ability to socialize, these kind of things. So we have to think about how can technology help us achieve these kind of goals as well. Next slide, please. Competencies. This is another key fundamental education goal, and I know this is particularly pertinent to the situation in India, where there is a huge demand for vocational skills and vocational education. The implementation of technology in education historically has tended to focus on academic education and less on vocational education and training. And yet, we need to, when we're thinking about using technology in education, particularly for vocational education, we need to think about the specific requirements. And then the final education goal, which I think, in many cases it's the most important, next slide, is happiness. Increasingly, the measure of the success of a nation's education system is seen in how it produces self-fulfilled, happy population. And we're now looking at, as well as GDP being used as a measure of a nation's development, but also gross happiness index as well. So these are all the key things that we need to think about. These are the national strategic education goals we need to think about when we're thinking about ICT in education. And there are some very interesting and quite important changes occurring. Next slide, please. To give you an example, this is a list of 5 jobs that I've plucked out of the jobs page of a local newspaper. And five years ago, some of these jobs did not exist. And not only did they not exist, but nobody had actually even thought about them. We hadn't even imagined that these jobs could exist. So the fundamental question also is, how do we educate our young people in order to be able to do these take part in these roles that we don't even know what they are yet? And this is one of the fundamental challenges that faces education throughout the world. Next slide. Thank you. Talk a little bit about the PISA, the international assessment of learning standards across a number of countries throughout the world. The PISA test is often used as it's used to rank nations as a comparative indication of how well their education systems perform. That's actually a misuse of PISA. PISA was never intended to be used as a kind of a beauty parade for education systems. This particular diagram is very interesting and pertinent for what we're talking about, because it shows the level of attainment for the PISA tests. So if if children are doing PISA tests in science or mathematics, they're ranked from 0 up to 6, 6 being the highest level. Now, if you'll notice between 1 and 2, there is an employability boundary. And basically, people who fall below the level, that particular level in PISA levels, on the whole, tend to end up in low-skilled employment or unemployed. So the education system should be pushing people onto the other side of the employability boundary, moving them up onto the level 2 and upwards. If you analyze PISA and the way that PISA works, what is interesting is that the higher you move up the PISA rankings, the greater the increase in problem solving and collaborative, what we call 21st century skills. Now, traditional education tended to favour knowledge-based skills, but they're no longer valid. And the other thing that is also happening is that employability boundary, as time goes by and there is a greater demand for these kind of collaborative analytical skills, that employability boundary is actually moving upwards. So in terms of education goals, again, before we even think about technology, we have to think about how we can provide young people with core skills to enable them to take part in the 21st century economies and societies. Next slide, please. Thank you. And collaboration is a fundamental skill that young people need to develop. The ability to work with others. We have these massive transnational projects now. The ability to work in a group. Next slide. Critical thinking and analysis. Getting children not to regurgitate knowledge, but to actually learn the processes of critical thinking and analysis, what we call the scientific method. Next slide. And so these skills are the core skills that we need to focus on in our education systems. But the fundamental question is, how do we assess these competencies? How do we assess these 21st century skills? And how can we use technology to do this? Historically, knowledge-based assessment is very easy. You ask 10 fact-based questions, and then depending on whether the answer is right or wrong, you then can assess the child. But we're now talking about these very complex competencies and these 21st century skills. How do you do things like, for example, assess the ability to collaborate? How do you assess problem solving? Next slide, please. And the answer lies in going back to question-centered education. And actually, historically, this is not new. This is not a new form of education. It actually predates our industrial-based education system. It developed out of principles enshrined in religions like Buddhism, or the Guru-shishya method, or the Socratic questioning. The education system was based on the search for truth, on developing reasoning skills, and understanding the student's thinking by asking questions, by asking significant questions. And this is where ICT has a fundamental role to play. Next slide, please. So, for example, in Promethean, we've developed a whole series of learner response systems and activities that are based on questions for learning, assessment for learning, where we take this question-based education system, which encourages these 21st century skills, and we can use technology in order to have the whole class engaged in thinking critically about questions and answers. Next slide, please. And there's been very interesting research that's been done on student achievement using ICT for questioning. For example, there are two models for this. One where the traditional one where the teacher asks the question and the children all answer, they all vote, they all give an answer, and that has certain advantages because the technology allows every child to have a voice. But in the second model, the teacher asks a question, then you have peer discussion, then you have voting, followed by a discussion. And research has shown that that second model, using ICT for question-based learning, is actually far more powerful and increases student achievement quite dramatically. Next slide, please. Next slide. I think that's one. Oh, thank you very much. Okay. The other thing that we have to think about in the implementation of technology in education, and this again is moving up to a kind of a national strategic level, is capacity building. When we're talking about an education system as vast and complex as India's, how do we effectively introduce ICT into education to affect systemic change across a massive scale? And there are three key things that we need to focus on. Obviously, leadership is a fundamental part of this, but also scalability and sustainability. We have to ensure the solutions that we introduce can be scaled, and not only scaled, but also sustained. Next slide, please. And this, I think, is essentially where we, at Promethean, we've developed a strategic approach which is designed to develop this scalable and sustainable approach to ICT in education. And again, it all comes back down to identifying your education goals first. What is it that you want to achieve in terms of education? Secondly, refine those education goals. What does it mean in a practical sense down in the classroom? If you want to if you want to get all your students to achieve a certain result, how is that actually going to work out from a pedagogical point of view? So forget the technology and focus on the pedagogy. Once we understand that, then we can create our proposal. Then we can choose our technology, how it's going to be implemented, how the teachers are going to be trained, and then we can also design a system for managed support. And we found that one of the most effective ways to do this, next slide, one of the most effective ways to do this, particularly in the case of building capacity, is through prototyping instead of piloting. And historically in the implementation of ICT in education, people have tended to go for a pilot model where you create this rather complex proof of concept to implement a certain technology in a school or a number of schools. And at the end of it, you get a report and you kind of see some results, and it's more like a research piece. For us, sorry, can you next slide please? We found that it's more effective to go for an iterative prototyping model, so that instead of doing a pilot, what you actually do is you choose a small cluster of schools and you implement your specific system with the idea of refining it to create a blueprint that can then be applied applied and scaled across your education system. So next slide please. Thank you. So if you develop a blueprint rather than develop a pilot, then it gives you your proof of concept, but it will also, because it's a prototype designed to be reproduced, it gives you proof that it can be replicated, and it gives you proof of scalability and capacity. So this is for us, I think, one of the answers to the issue as to how you can make sure that if you are going to tackle your education goals with ICT, first of all understanding your education goals and then creating a prototype to address those goals is the most effective way for scaling and sustaining a solution. Next slide please. So again, from our point of, from my point of view, my experience working with technology in education, the most important thing is identifying your goals, creating your system, prototyping your system, and ensuring that when you implement it, you have your support, your training, and your pedagogy built into what you're trying to achieve, rather than just putting lots of computers into classrooms or iPads or tablets into classrooms. So next slide, please. So to conclude, I mean, as I said, I've talked in fairly broad terms about education goals and strategic approaches. But again, as I said at the beginning of my piece, I think if there's one lesson that I've learned, and I think is fundamental to the success of ICT in education anywhere throughout in the world, it's this, and it's the effective implementation of ICT in class is driven by education goals, not technology goals. We have to follow and understand what we're trying to achieve in terms of learning outcomes, rather than follow the next exciting piece of technology to come from Apple or Microsoft or anybody else. And that's a very kind of quick summary of my position and experience in terms of this question. Next slide, please. So just to finish off, those are my contact details if anybody wishes to contact me to talk more about this. Next slide. I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and I apologize for the tiny text, but I hope this has been useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for that very insightful presentation. That was very helpful, especially how great you highlighted the importance of identifying the education goals and how to blend in that technology. I would now like to introduce Takuya Homa, who is from Quipper, and he will be telling us about some of their successful models. They're quite active in a few international markets, so he's going to give us some background to that and how the company is looking to adapt their model to India. Takuya?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Takia. Please go to the next slide. Please go to right, so in today's talk, I'd like to give you a quick introduction of Quipper and then want to highlight, so we've been working in many different countries. I want to compare India with other countries and then highlight on the strengths of India in terms of education technology, and also some of the weaknesses or the things that India can probably work on to just give you some insights as to how India can improve with edtech. So Quipper was a very small company, very young company, started off in London. We currently have 100 employees based in our London office, Tokyo, Manila, Jakarta, and Mexico City. And our main product, Quipper School, is now being used by more than 1 million students all around the world. And our corporate motto is distributed wisdom. We've been working with thousands of teachers in India as well. So India is a very interesting market. Please go to the next slide. Please go to the next slide. So I'd like to talk about there's some text are missing, but we've been working with a lot of teachers from a lot of countries, and we've identified some universal problems amongst teachers. One is lack of time. So teachers are very busy, and most of the time it's being spent on making sure that homework is properly done. So 10% of the class time is spent on homework, and 20% of their time at school is for homework as well. And also teachers are unable to customize content and teaching for struggling students. So it's very difficult to customize the content, and so we wanted to enable teachers to just do this. And another thing is the poor use of IT. So universally, teachers have been having a hard time providing the right IT solutions to the students, and lack of IT adoption within the classroom, as well as the lack of IT materials. Please go to the next slide. Right, so we've got some solutions to these problems, and it's very, very simple how it works. I'm not sure if the slide is displayed properly, but so teachers can create online assignments based on the content that we create with local teachers. So all the content that we create is aligned to the national curriculum of each country. So tens of thousands of questions available to teachers, and then they can create online assignments. And then students can receive the assignment on any internet-connected devices, and then teachers can then analyze students' performance in the class online as well. So this is how it works. It's very, very simple, and that's probably why it's being used by so many teachers and students all around the world. Next slide, please. So yeah, these are some of the users using Quipper School inside the classroom. Some of them are using tablets, some of them are using smartphones, some of them are using desktop, laptop. It's available on all the devices. So yeah. So we have many users in India using our platform as well. So from the next slide, I'd like to highlight some of the unique perspectives about edtech India, and then the implications that had for India's future of education. Next slide, please. Right. One of the big characteristics of India is high education expenditure. So Indian people are very willing to pay a lot of money for education compared to the countries in which we currently operate, namely Indonesia, the Philippines, Mexico, and Thailand as well. And it's a huge amount of money is being spent on education, especially private education in India. So if you take a look at the left panel, so private school, $9 billion is spent on private schools annually, despite much smaller in numbers than government schools. So the left chart is the number of schools based on the type of the school. So government school, 250,000 government schools exist in India. And then Tier 1, which means private schools from Tier 1 cities. So it's in 15,000. And then the private schools in Tier 2, Tier 3 cities, there are 70,000 such schools. But if you take a look at the right pie chart, the money spent for each type, so for Tier 1 school, $4 $0.5 billion is spent, and then tier 2, tier 3 schools, private schools, $3.4 billion is spent. And in comparison, government schools, although they have a lot of numbers, $600 million only is being spent. So there's a huge amount of money going into private education, and it's very unique compared to the other countries where education is regarded as for free. And the next one is the after-school test prep and tutorial market are big as well. So tutorial centers are very popular in India, and people are spending more money on tutorial centers than on normal school fees. So for average students from tier 1 private schools, so they spend $500 for school fees, and then they spend $800 for private school tuition fees. So tutorial center tuition fees. So a lot of money is being put into this education, and what that means is I think it's difficult without money going into this field for education companies to be successful. There are so many NPOs and government-oriented initiatives, but money has to be there, and India is really big with that regard. Please go to the next slide. The next point is, so India already has high IT adoption inside the classrooms compared to the other countries. So many private schools are already embracing digital technology inside the classrooms, and good ICT infrastructure is already available at schools, especially at private schools. So tens of thousands of schools in India are already using IT for classroom activities. Many classroom edtech solutions exist, such as Smart Class by Edgecomb, and there are many, many solutions that are being used inside classrooms already. And if you take a look at the right panel, so most of the CBSE schools are required to have good ICT facilities, and even affordable private schools, which are kind of cheap private schools, have good ICT facilities. So if you take a look at this bar chart, 70% of affordable private schools have computer labs, although only 13% have science labs, or 24% have libraries. So Indian schools are already embracing IT, which is very important because in many countries in which we operate, there are some kind of hesitance on the part of teachers or the school principals to accept or embrace this kind of digital technology, but Indian schools are already embracing it, which is important. Next slide, please. And also, there are a lot of edtech entrepreneurs in India, big and small, in every single domain of the education industry. So in most of the countries in which we operate, again in the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, there are some edtech companies, but they are very few in numbers. But in India, there are hundreds or maybe thousands of some successful, some unsuccessful edtech companies. But this ecosystem of having a lot of entrepreneurs trying to improve education with the power of technology is very strong, and I think this is going to be a very important aspect of India's future in terms of edtech success. Please go to the next page. So with high education expenditure and high IT adoption inside the classrooms and edtech entrepreneurship, I believe India is ripe for edtech revolution. These initiatives are extremely important and always lack in other countries, but India already has these characteristics. So I'm pretty sure that India is going to be successful to implement and to embrace education technologies to improve the country's education. However, please go to the next page. There are some challenges, and there are some kind of problems still we have to solve. Please go to the next page. So number one problem is government school has very poor IT infrastructure and adoption. So I mentioned most of the private schools, a lot of private schools have good ICT facility and good ICT adoption. However, government schools cannot afford and are not embracing IT at the moment. And number 2 is low grassroots IT adoption. So compared to the other countries, Indian schools IT is implemented top down, so from the principal to from the school admin to principal to teachers and then students. However, I think in order to for edtech to be more successful, I think this order has to be reversed. Please go to the next page. And I think there are some hints that we can take from other countries. Number 1, so for pro-government school IT infrastructure and adoption, I think the solution, one of the solutions could be mobile internet and bring your own device movement. Probably can enable government schools to maximize edtech. So as you know, mobile internet is growing exponentially in all parts of the world, and India is not an exception. And with mobile internet, people can access, students, teachers can access to a vast amount of educational content, vast amount of educational services on the internet, pretty much for free. That's very important. And bring your own device. So we have done a survey to our users, and 79% of critical school teachers allow use of mobile devices at school for the critical school tasks. So in most of the countries, especially developed countries, teachers are still hesitant, have some reservations for encouraging their students to bring their own devices and then let them do the work using the device. However, our users in Indonesia and Philippines are already embracing these new technologies, mobile technologies, to use at school, because it's much better than the previous technologies, and also it comes in handy for students and teachers. And 55% of critical school students already use mobile devices at school to complete the critical school tasks. So these trends are very important because this allows government schools, which might not necessarily have a lot of money and ICT, traditional ICT infrastructure, to tap into what exists, the new things that are available on the internet now. Please go to the next slide. This is probably the most annoying picture that this is a school from Indonesia using Kupa School. So the majority of the students are using their own smartphones or tablet computers. There's one student using laptop, but most of them are using their smartphones inside their classroom. And I think this is what's happening in Southeast Asia. And also this is something probably that's going to happen in India as well. Next page, please. Can you go to the next page? Thank you. So for the second problem, low grassroots IT adoption, there are many bottom-up edtech companies now being born, and teachers are at the core of driving edtech revolution. So there are many free edtech services used by millions of users. Edmods are, I think, used by more than 30, 40 million users. And Khan Academy, I think everyone knows about this. Hundreds of millions of users are using Khan Academy, and reminds Class Dojo and Kupa School. So the core, the common characteristics, one is it's for free, and it's easy to use, available online, and it can be used anywhere, anytime. And these kind of free edtech services, which don't require a lot of initial capital investment to use, are becoming more and more popular, and the threshold for teachers to using this kind of service is getting lower as well. And there are many teachers who are, so basically Kupa School is driven by Kupa School teachers. So they use Kupa School, they start using it, and then after they start liking our service, they explain our service to their colleagues or their principals, and then the school decides to implement Kupa School inside their school. And I think that's the kind of reverse order compared to the traditional ways of ICT or edtech services being used. And I think this is going to be the trend, and it's going to be even more important in the future. Next slide, please. So yeah, these are the teachers who gathered on their own budget to come to see other teachers, to interact with our developers, because they believe that they are the ones who are driving education technology, and they are the ones who are implementing the services to improve their child's education. And I think this is the future, and we want to make sure that we are the ones who are going to enable this. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, Takuya. Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. That was very helpful. We have a couple of questions for both speakers. I'm going to ask the first question for John now. I'm going to try to go through as many questions as I can, and just to remind attendees that you can submit your questions on the right-hand side of your screens in that little box, and we'll raise them. John, the first question, you mentioned the impact on early years on cohesion, and one of our attendees was wondering if you could point to any further reading or mention any other sources that you would recommend in regards to this impact on early years.
Absolutely. There is an OECD study that's been done on this. I have the reference, unfortunately I don't have it to hand. I mean, if whoever is asking the question wants to contact me by my email address, then I'm happy to share the reference. But there was some very interesting research done. There was a 5-year UNESCO OECD project done on the impact of early learning on social cohesion, and in terms of things like health, personal health, in terms of socialization. Basically, if you teach children fundamental ethical principles at a very, very young age, and we're talking about from 3 or 4 years onwards, then it has massive impact on society. And again, historically, education budgeting and the policy is often focused on secondary education, whereas in fact this kind of early years education is really, really important. But there is I'm pretty sure it's an OECD report. It's either OECD or UNESCO. I think it's OECD. But I can certainly provide the reference if anybody wants to contact me. I can send them.
Great. Thank you very much. I think there's another question for Takuya, and this one relates to vocational skills. Someone is wondering about whether your method has been used to impart vocational skills, and if you could kind of give an example of how it's being applied.
Right. So actually in Indonesia, many vocational schools are using our platform as well. We are not providing like 21st century skills or vocational specific skills, but still these students working at or studying at vocational schools have to learn the basic skills. And we're providing the questions or lessons which help them acquire these basic skills with the power of digital technology. I think what's important here is the fact that they're using digital technologies, for example, Kuiper School, to learn something is already helping them go to the next level, because the learning on the internet or learning with digital technology is going to be an important skill itself as well in the future. So I hope I answered your question.
Great, thank you, Takuya. And John, would you have any comments also on this question on how the method has been imparted on vocational skills? Could you also maybe pitch in?
Yeah, I mean, vocational education is a particular challenge. I mean, I attended a conference in Delhi. I think it was in September, specifically to do with vocational education. And the key question for vocational education is the assessment of competencies. How do you assess somebody's ability to undertake a task, like, for example, fix an engine or build a wall or this kind of thing. And I think that again is a perfect example of how the education goals need to be kind of really embedded first. I think that needs to be a close cooperation between industry and government in order to establish the qualifications and the certification needed. Now, technology can be extremely valuable for actually doing assessment and certification in the field. I mentioned in my piece, I mentioned the learner response systems, the little voting units. These are very useful for using in the field, in building sites, in workshops, etc. But for doing guided assessments of students as part of the vocational education process. But again, I mean, I think it's a perfect example of how and I know this from what I learned when I was at the conference, is the great challenge is effective establishing your qualifications, establishing your certification, establishing your assessment process, and then choosing the technology that best fits that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think that's it for today. There weren't very many questions other than a lot of interest in getting a copy of the presentation, which we will do at the end of the webinar. So again,
sorry, can I have the reference, by the way, for the early learning question. Just
great.
Quickly. It's an OECD paper. And it's called Improving Health and Social Cohesion Through Education. Improving Health and Social Cohesion Through Education. And the authors are Miyamoto, that's Miyamoto, and Schuller, Schuller, 2010. So it's an OECD publication, and it goes into great detail. Sorry to interrupt.
That's fine. Thank you, John. I'm sure that's very helpful for the attendees. So on your screens, you're seeing right now the upcoming e-learning webinars. Just to remind you, we are working on this campaign for the next few months. So feel free to drop us a line if you have any ideas on any other topics that you would like to see covered. Feel free to visit our website where we have more registration details for these upcoming e-learning webinars. And again, we have the Twitter dialogue going on at the eLearning India hashtag. So feel free to just pop by and drop any comments or any views that you have on the theme. Thanks again, everybody, for your time, and I hope this webinar was very valuable to you, as it was certainly for us. If you have any feedback or comments about today's session, please feel free to get in touch. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to our speakers for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.